And I'm the Senior Director. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar topic, Managing Budget Challenges and Long-Term Liabilities During Fiscal Uncertainty. My name is James Collins, and I am the Senior Director of Business Development here at CSBA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. If at any time during today's webinar you have a question for our panelists or experience a technical issue, please use the questions tab of your Zoom dashboard. We have reserved time toward the end of today's presentation to address as many of your questions as time permits. However, if your question is not answered during the course of this webinar, please feel free to email csba@csba.org and our staff will assist you. Now I'd like to introduce today's panelists, Chris Reef, Legislative Director, Governmental Relations here at CSBA, and Ryan Nicasio, Senior Vice President at PARS. So at this time, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, James. What I'll say first is if you have questions, please use the Q&A function as opposed to the comments or the chat section. The chat we won't see it. So please do use the Q&A function, and then we'll get to all the questions at the end of at least the budget presentation. So as many of you might know, we are here to present the May Revise. The May Revise is basically a representation of the revised revenues that the state has collected as a result of the April 15th tax filing deadline. So in terms of the budget timeline, what happens is that the governor typically presents his proposed budget in January. By January 10th, it's constitutionally required. And then by May 14th, he's supposed to revise his budget proposals as it relates to actual revenues that have come in the door, and then provide an update, not just in terms of the general fund, but also in terms of how those revenues are impacting Prop 98. So this is what we're going to present to you today in relation to the overall May Revise and where we sit in both vis-a-vis the general fund, overall state revenues, and the governor's budget proposals for Prop 98. Next slide. Next slide. So in January, we were pleased to see the governor come with a budget that had a very, very modest surplus of $363 million. But again, at that time, it was just a proposed budget. A number of things had not occurred. One thing, obviously, that had not occurred, literally, I think the day or the day after is when the wildfires in LA occurred and in Ventura counties. And so those are weighing heavily in terms of what type of revenues we were seeing. Then also, of course, we have the new federal administration coming in. And that has really caused a number of unforeseen circumstances and unpredictable impacts on revenues. And then on top of that, we also have just the growing cost of healthcare, and that growing cost of healthcare is having an impact on the state's Medi-Cal system. So Medi-Cal, provides healthcare services for a number of different populations. Those programs that program has expanded substantially in the last 5 to 10 years, and has grown the costs or the expenditures on the non-98 side of the budget. So when I'm talking about the budget, right, here's the state budget. Here is 40%. 40% of the state budget is Prop 98. Prop 98 is all public education, as we all know. The other 60% is everything else that the state provides that are very much, things that we're all very passionate about. Public safety, healthcare, transportation, and other things. This will be a common theme throughout, in that this side of the budget and the expenditures are growing, as well as this side of the budget, but this side of the budget is guaranteed in terms of the minimum amount of funding that Prop 98 provides, i.e. the minimum funding guarantee. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll get into Prop 98 and where we stand. And so right now, the minimum guarantee has been revised a little bit down to about $118.9 billion for the current year. For next year, it's estimated to be about $114.6 billion. Now, there is a split. Remember, Prop 98 funds not just TK-12 education, it also funds the community colleges, so TK to 14. And we typically call this the split. So typically, the split is about 11% for community colleges and about 89% for the TK-12 system. Now, remember that when we do budgets, we budget over a 3-year period. That 3-year period typically is always actually prior year, current year, and next year. So when I say 3-year budget period, those are the time periods that it captures. I will point here to the suspension reference here, the 98.5. As you might remember, back in 2023, when we had those severe winter storms, we had a delay in tax collections for all California residents. This included delaying tax receipts until October 15th and then again until November 15th. That caused the legislature and the governor to adopt a budget based upon projected revenues as opposed to actual revenues. So, whereas we typically have them revised relying on what actual numbers are coming in, they had to develop a budget in 2024 that reflected what they thought the numbers were. In my 20 years in the legislature and working around the Capitol, this has never been done before. This was completely uncharted territory. And as a result, they used a little bit more rosier numbers than expected, than what actually came in. So we actually saw a drop in revenues. And so the state over appropriated, if you will, over appropriated Prop 98 to the tune of about $8 billion. Now, the thing was, is that was all money that was budgeted, all money that went to districts to be able to pay for enrollment and pay for providing public education and other costs. And so within that construct, that was why 98 had to get suspended, because they suspended it down to meet the demands of what the money they had on hand. Now, in terms of the Prop 98 and the guarantee, the way that suspension works is that $8 billion gets repaid to Prop 98 over time. So that $8 billion in debt, the fancy term that we use for it is called maintenance factor. That maintenance factor is repaid over time based upon a formula, but that will have impacts in terms of what the guarantee will be in the coming year and how we count on public education funding going forward. Next slide. So the bigger piece in terms of what we saw out of the January budget comparative to the May revise is that we still do see Prop 98 grow over the 3-year budget period, but to a lesser extent. And so there was a projection that the Prop 98 guarantee would grow by about $7.5 billion over that 3-year period. That's been revised down to a $2.9 billion growth. That is good in that we still continue to see growth as opposed to a lesser guarantee. We're going to continue to be in what's called a test 1 year. So for those of you who are aware, Prop 98 is guided by 3 formula tests. These tests basically guide what the minimum guarantee will be in any fiscal year. Test 1 typically tends to be the more common test that we're seeing apply in these past few years. The test 1 and test 2 comparatively are the ones that we typically see over the lifetime of Prop 98. Remember, Prop 98 passed in 1988, has been on the books for 37 years. Test 1, Test 2 have been the more operative tests over that time. And Test 1 is estimated to be, like I said, remember I said it was about 40%. Well, more accurately, it's 39.6, but generally speaking, when we talk about it, we say 40%. Next slide. So there is a reserve requirement. Those of you who might recall, the voters passed an initiative, Proposition 2, that established the reserves. There is a Prop 98 reserve that basically requires the state, when in good times, to deposit money into the reserve, and the reserve cap is 3%. So whenever the state Prop 98 reserve it hits its max, which is 3% of the overall Prop 98, then it actually triggers a local reserve cap. Well, although we did see a substantial amount of growth in our revenues during the pandemic, we had to use a substantial amount of the reserves, actually all of the reserves, so full $8 billion in the reserves in last year's budget to pay for the drop in revenues. But because we're seeing some increased revenues, modest increase in revenues over the last 6 months, there is a calculated $540 million deposit into the reserve. This is different than what we saw in January. January had a mandatory deposit about $1.2 billion. Well, that because of the drop in the revised estimates, that amount is down to 540. Because of it's formula driven, it actually requires that 540 million to be fully withdrawn next year. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, We will not have anything in the Prop 98 reserve if revenues continue to drop and impacts the funding guarantee. On the other, however, the way that the statewide reserve operates is that when we max out our Prop 98 reserve, it triggers a local reserve cap of 10% for local school districts in county offices. For many districts, including our smalls and our basic aids or our community funded districts, they are exempt from that local reserve cap. And it also applies only to unassigned funds as opposed to assigned funds. So it provides quite a bit of flexibility, which were concessions that CSBA had gotten within Prop 2, which was important in terms of budget stability and operational flexibility. Next slide. There is a COLA proposed. As you might recall, in the January budget, the COLA was estimated to be 2.43%. That COLA has been revised down to 2.3. This is a list of the categorical programs, grant programs that are statutorily required to get a COLA. I will flag the fourth bullet, the state preschool program. The state is actually proposing to waive the COLA for this program. This is reflective of growing costs on both sides of the budget. State preschool is funded both with Prop 98 and general fund or non-98 funds. And so the COLA they would receive has been waived to be able to preserve some additional impacts, if you will, or save some budget impacts on the overall state budget. Next slide. Now we are seeing some things in terms of Prop 98 that give us quite a bit of pause. So you might recall in last year's budget, we were referring to the Prop 98 maneuver. So if we go back in time and remember when I was talking about the Prop 98 $8 billion over appropriation, in our, that although it was an over appropriation, it is still money that gets counted towards the guarantee. It covers what our local costs are. So this is something that we are actually suing the governor and the administration on. This $8 billion maneuver is something that gives us quite a bit of concern. And one of the way that the maneuver number one works, it says, okay, if two things happen, the state can arbitrarily lower the Prop 98 guarantee. So that is a delay in tax receipts over 2 weeks, and that those tax receipts account for 50% of the state's revenues, right? And so from that perspective, if there was another natural disaster and tax collections were delayed, and that resulted in a substantial drop in revenues to the tune of over 50% potentially in terms of impact, then they could arbitrarily lower the guarantee, resetting the floor in terms of how the guarantee is funded going forward. We have argued that that's unconstitutional or suing the state. So that's last year. Now we're seeing a second maneuver, more of a manipulation, if you will. So what the governor has proposed doing is to withhold $1.3 billion in Prop 98 funding. The argument here is that, hey, because of our volatile revenue structure, we don't know if this money is going to come due. Well, and we're going to withhold this money, and then we'll reconcile next year when we settle up, if you will. Well, that's again not how Prop 98 is drawn up. And if we go to the next slide, what this really reflects is a very concerning precedent. This is the second time in as many years that the administration has proposed manipulating or underfunding Prop 98. Now, 1.3 billion in a guarantee that has 118.9 doesn't seem like a lot of money, but the question is, what's to stop them from withholding $5 billion or $10 billion or $15 billion? And so this is a very dangerous precedent, and again, something that we would argue is unconstitutional, and are considering what our next steps might look like. Of course, acknowledging the fact that we're already in litigation with the administration over the first maneuver, if you will. So remains to be seen. We continue to advocate for this because that type of budget predictability, right? That minimum funding guarantee is incredibly important to all LEAs or local educational agencies across the state in terms of how they project out their budgets, i.e., how do they help and cover what their local obligations are for pension costs. So these are fairly significant issues that we continue to monitor and advocate for or against, if you will. So next slide. So now we're going to get into specific budget proposals that the governor put forward. These are things that he put forward in January or have modified since January. Most and predominant within them is the Student Support and Professional Development Discretionary Block Grant. Some of you might recall that there was what's called an Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Block Grant, Discretionary Block Grant that was proposed during the pandemic. We've been informed that the intent of this discretionary block grant is to be modeled after that Arts, Music, and Instructional Materials Block Grant. In the same fashion, is that the intent is that this one money would be discretionary. However, although we welcome this idea of it being discretionary and fully advocate for this 1.7 billion to be fully discretionary, there is language that gives us concern that's in the budget trailer bill that came out after the May revise was proposed, that basically requires districts to use their allocation of this block grant to first pay for unfunded mandate claims. Well, the problem with that is that this doesn't really address the issue of it being discretionary because you're actually using the discretionary block grant for past claims when the block grant is inherently being proposed for increased costs or ongoing costs that are in this particular year and going forward. That said, we also understand from some testimony provided by the Department of Finance going forward that this discretionary block grant was also in part proposed to help address the ongoing impacts of some of the AB 218 claims that some of you might be familiar with, which was the legislation from 2019 that resurrected the statute of limitations for child sexual assault and harassment claims. And so we know that there is a good number of districts that are really facing some fairly existential pressures from these claims because of the size of the settlement award. So in some respects, this is the administration's nod to how the state can provide some additional dollars that provide the support or help address those issues. Again, remains to be seen. 1.7 is not going to go a long way, but again, we really want to make sure that this block grant remains fully discretionary. Next slide. In special education, as you know, special education costs continue to rise. Special education does get the 2.3% COLA, which is welcome. We don't see any major proposals. We do see here an additional $10 million to help with dyslexia screenings. Dyslexia screenings were required by last year's budget and is an ongoing cost. There's essentially 5 vendors that can provide these screenings that districts must choose from. One of them is free. The other 4 are districts have to pay for locally. Obviously, many of the districts chose to go towards the one that was free. Well, that overwhelmed the provider, and so this $10 million is being provided to help them address this increased demand. Next slide. In literacy, we continue to see renewed focus on issues around helping students access literacy. The governor is dyslexic. There's been a lot of focus on issues of dyslexia. Really, what that has been a catalyst for is helping raise awareness on just issues of literacy. Dyslexia is one component or one challenge to a student's access to literacy. We've also seen some impacts of the pandemic on our reading comprehension for students across the state. And so the state has been investing quite a bit of funding, one time especially, in providing additional supports for students in addressing their access to literacy. So there's a maintained $535 million to provide literacy coaches and other types of supports for students, especially and all for high needs and underrepresented districts. There's an additional $200 million proposed to help fund, and this should say, I apologize, AB 1454, not AB 454. Again, AB 1454. This is legislation that is going through the legislature right now to help address and provide greater supports for evidence-based learning instructional practices, and that will come with a revised English language arts, English language development instructional materials framework, which will be required of the State Board of Education to adopt. So it remains to be seen. We will see that legislation go forward, and most likely is expected to reach the governor's desk and be signed into law. Next slide. In teacher recruitment and preparation, we do see and welcome additional funding being invested here because of the type of shortfalls and shortages that we are seeing in the number of teachers and classified staff in our schools. There was a $150 million proposed in the January budget to do a kind of a teacher recruitment and incentive program. Well, That got revised via proposal right after the January budget into a loan forgiveness program that then has been recalibrated now into a $100 million program to fund stipends for student teachers. I will flag that this is only supposed to be for teachers, teaching candidates who are pursuing a full cleared credential as opposed, so it's not allowed for inter-credential teachers. For what that's worth, there's an additional 14.2 million for the Golden State Teacher Program for a total of 64.2 million. The Golden State Teacher Program, probably one of the more successful programs that has been stood up in several years. This provides two $10,000 grants over 2 years. And so that's $10,000 per year for students who teaching candidates who are going through their teaching candidacy. And then there's also some additional waivers and extensions provided for those who have received some waivers on their RECA and their other types of assessments. The RECA is the Reading Instruction Competence Assessment, and those have been were waived during the pandemic because we weren't doing in-person assessments. And then also at the same time, the RECA test has been sunsetted, so it's on its way out with a new test being brought in through the teaching performance assessments. Next slide. UTK and state preschool, so a little bit of a double-edged sword again here. We appreciate the governor's continued rebench of Prop 98. When I say rebench, it means putting new money into Prop 98, growing the guarantee, right? This is the largest expansion of a public education program in a generation. And so this enrollment growth is having substantial impact on district operations and county operations. That this additional money is welcome and is needed because otherwise we're getting the same piece of butter and basically spreading over a larger piece of toast. So we are thankful to see that rebench, because if you do the rebench, if you think about it, right, that 40% and you're rebenching, you're actually pushing that Prop 98 guarantee out into this side of the budget. So that's putting pressure on this side of the budget. It's not an easy task. It's both it is equally as important as a fiscal proposal and as much as it's a political proposal because of the type of fiscal impacts it has on the non-98 side of the budget. However, we still see logistical issues in terms of implementing universal transitional kindergarten. That has been a real challenge. We continue to struggle to find TK teachers, find classroom space, and just the overall logistics of implementing TK. One thing I will flag here is that there are some penalties that have been proposed to help incentivize local educational agencies to be able to meet a lower adult to student ratio. So for the coming school year, the ratio for TK classrooms is going to be required to be 1 to 10 as opposed to 1 to 12. There are 3 different penalties that are being proposed. One would be on if you exceed the actual ratio size. One will be if you exceed the classroom size. And then the other will be if you exceed or violate the required credentialing requirements or the staffing requirements for adults in that classroom. So something to be mindful of, because these will impact districts' operations, especially if as it relates to the districts accommodating more students who are coming in the door. Remember, when students come in the door, they must be enrolled. And so they must be found a spot in a program, in a TK program. And so sometimes these things are beyond the control of the district and can automatically trigger these penalties as currently drafted. So next slide. Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, ELOP. This was a program that was proposed during the pandemic. This is a program that's really kind of more after school based. What it was really intended to do was to address the lost learning opportunities students experienced during the pandemic. Well, here we are. Obviously, we're still feeling the ramifications, the ripple effects of the pandemic, but we are not in the heart of the pandemic anymore. I will just say this is a substantial categorical program. It was just under 4 billion at the beginning of the year. The governor proposed an additional 435 million, which bring it up to about 4.4. He is then now adding an additional 80.5 to bring it to over 4.5 or over $4.4 billion in total ongoing Prop 98 funds. for a particular purpose that one could argue is not for the core instructional day, which is what Prop 98 is for. And so we do welcome, of course, though this fourth bullet, which is the $10 million to help increase the minimum LEA grant or the minimum school grant from 50,000 to 100,000 per site. That is welcome, especially in terms of our economies of scale for our smaller school districts and our more rural school districts, where they may not have the number of students in the program to really meet that capacity of and the economies of scale. And so that minimum grant increase is welcome. But again, this is a fairly large and ongoing categorical grant program. Next slide. Universal school meals. This is welcome. I'll just say this program could be most impacted by current actions at the federal level. We see the state continue to put additional dollars into the universal school meals, and we are providing breakfast and lunch for all students, regardless of a means test, which is good news. We're serving almost a billion meals, over a billion meals a year for our students. However, again, we do get a substantial amount of funding from the federal government for this program. And so, although we have been told that the federal actions, i.e., the big beautiful bill, if that's how you would like to refer to it, has uh, saved student meal programs from the cuts, that remains to be seen. And again, we are unclear on what type of impacts ultimately we will see coming out of the federal government. So stay tuned on universal school meals. Next slide. This is a slide that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. As you know, these are things that you guys track very closely. I'll just say that, as you know, these rates are extraordinarily market driven. These are extraordinary. We are at the whim and mercy of how the market is going. The on again, off again tariffs are really having a detrimental impact on the market, also in terms of the state's the federal government's bond market as well. And so remains to be seen whether or not CalPERS and CalSTRS will be able to accommodate for that in terms of investment strategies. And of course, as you know, STRS is a little bit different, much more of a homogeneous population. Their rates are required, are limited to 1% increase over year, as opposed to CalPERS, which is a little bit more of the wild, wild west. So just we're going to watch the market and see what federal actions we'll have on pension costs statewide and locally, of course. So next slide. At the end of the day, the major issues are that healthcare costs, on the one hand, are having impact on the non-98 side of the budget, i.e. Medi-Cal, right? The expanded eligibility that we've seen for Medi-Cal is expanding the expenditures side of the budget. However, at the federal level, that could potentially have an even greater impact uh, on not just the non-98 say, but of course Prop 98 funding in terms of a lot of the federal education programs that the state relies on. Estimates have varied in terms of what would federal cuts to education title programs. We're hearing different things. It would be presumptive for me to kind of get there out there and say what the actual numbers are. But what I can say is that our state budget is not constructed in a fashion to offset substantial losses in federal funding. So how the state budget is constructed in response to what is occurring at the federal level remains to be seen. But if the cuts come as we continue to hear they will have a substantial impact on state and local educational agencies' operational budgets. We continue to be very worried about this maneuver number two, or this manipulation of Prop 98 funding, and as it relates to its constitutionality, as it relates to how we provide for the minimum funding guarantee. Yes, we do see a budget that does generally protect TK-12 education funding, which is very welcome, but there continues to be a real, dark clouds overhead. And so we continue to be watching that very closely. So with that, I think we can move. I just want to say thank you for my portion and happy to answer questions. I'm not sure if we're waiting for James to come back on, but I do see the Q&A here.
Chris, actually, we were holding questions to the end. It's Ryan's going to
Very,
take.
oh, the very, very end?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I unfortunately will not be able to stay to the very end, so I will answer them in the Q&A.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Chris. We appreciate the thorough coverage and summary of the May revise. Obviously, there are a lot of budget constraints and concerns surrounding that with, as you mentioned, expenditures are growing, kind of the federal actions and healthcare costs driving costs for the overall state budget, et cetera. So that always tends to put districts under a lot of pressure managing budgets and how to address surrounding liabilities associated with their employees and benefits that they offer, specifically with regard to OPEB or what OPEB liabilities and pension liabilities. So in my discussion today, I hope to briefly touch on OPEB, and how districts or what districts have been doing with regard to addressing those liabilities, how a 115 trust may be a very good option, viable option for addressing those, maybe some misconceptions with regard to funding or pre-funding OPEB liabilities, also touching on pension costs and how that affects. I think one of the last slides that Chris touched on are sort of those growing contribution rates from CalSTRS and CalPERS and the impact that the market has on that. Kind of again touching on what the benefits of pre-funding those liabilities and how that helps districts manage these long-term liabilities, especially during these uncertain fiscal times. So next slide, please. We can just kind of get started. What is OPEB? OPEB basically is an acronym for Other Post-Employment Benefits, essentially your retiree health benefits that are not benefits associated with a pension. So this is generally what state and local governments provide to their employees once they reach retirement age or when they retire. This can often expand across the spectrum from no retiree benefits being offered to a certain percentage or a dollar amount, maybe through a certain age, or even generous benefits being provided on a lifetime basis. So again, these are liabilities that affect school districts, and especially in times of uncertain budgets. This can be an additional constraint or pressure for local school districts. Specifically with regard to GASB, what is GASB 75? GASB is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board for reporting your liabilities or expenses on the district's financial statements. Previously, sort of the genesis of GASB 75 prior to GASB 75 was GASB 45. This was where districts were footnoting their retiree health or OPEB liabilities on their financial statements, sort of as a footnote. But through the years, this has evolved to GASB 75, where now you have to note what your net OPEB liability is. So the big change is not only recognizing what that liability amount is for your school district, but also the assets associated with that and what can be recognized. So kind of a truer picture of a liability associated with a school district associated with these OPEB benefits that are provided to your retirees. So I think GASB was trying to clarify or make clear what these obligations or liabilities were, and it became a little bit more stringent with regard to reporting it and how they define that. So that's where we are today with the GASB 75. Next slide, please. And kind of getting into, how are districts sort of addressing or paying out these obligations and oftentimes these unfunded obligations. I think what we more commonly see, or generally speaking, is sort of the first box here, the pay as you go. So that sort of speaks to as your employees transition from active participant status to retirement and become eligible for these retiree health benefits that your district may provide. Then as those expenses come up, this is what the district will pay out. So essentially paying as these expenses come up, pay as you go. so to speak. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing with actuarial valuations and these liabilities associated with retiree health benefits is that this pay-as-you-go expense or liability is continuing to grow, at a astounding rate. So it can be very taxing on a school district. The second item here in the middle, setting money aside in the general fund. So maybe districts are recognizing that they have these huge liabilities or expenditures associated with retiree health benefits, and maybe they earmark within their general fund or maybe a special fund. Sometimes I've heard districts noted as a Fund 20, but they will set aside money in that general fund to pay the sort of pay-as-you-go expenses as they come up. Third item, and this is what I want to speak to specifically today, is pre-funding using an IRS Section 115 trust, where you are essentially setting aside assets to pre-fund these liabilities that affect school districts associated with your OPEB or retiree health benefits. So as I continue, we'll look at sort of the benefits or how this impacts a school district between these three different options. Next slide, please. So the 115 trust, this is a trust that is available to school districts to pre-fund these liabilities. This is something in partnership with CSBA that PARS has done going back to 2006 to address these OPEB liabilities. On the left-hand side, we illustrate your OPEB side where assets are put into this bucket rather than setting aside or marking in your general fund. You actually have the ability to pre-fund your pension liabilities as well, because as Chris mentioned in his earlier discussion with regard to the rising contribution rates that everybody is associating with both CalSTRS and CalPERS, that is a growing liability as well. But what I'll focus on first is sort of the OPEB. So essentially, you do have the ability to pre-fund these liabilities, whether OPEB or pension, or both, if you want to address both in a 115 trust. Kind of the benefits of that, you are addressing these long-term liabilities. You have the flexibility with different investment options or strategies to address these liabilities, often associated with retiree medical health or OPEB. These may be long-term liabilities that your district is looking to pay out in the next 30 or 40 years as employees transition from active to retiree status, living well beyond their retirement age. So those are, you may have a longer investment horizon or liabilities associated with that. At the end of the day, you always have access at any time to these liabilities, whether you're pre-funding for OPEB or pension or both. It's just those specific funds have to be addressed or utilized for those expenses. Next slide, please. And this is going to get maybe an illustration of the benefit of pre-funding, where utilizing a 115 trust versus pay-as-you-go. And what we've done here is illustrate sort of a sample district kind of over a period of time, a 10-year period. Middle column kind of looking at sort of the start of addressing these OPEB liabilities, and then 10 years later looking at sort of the benefit of utilizing a 115 trust to pre-fund this liability. So maybe I could take a step back and address what an actuarial valuation is. Essentially that is where an actuary is looking at the benefits provided by the school district for OPEB or your retiree health benefits, and determining sort of a present value of what those liabilities are going to be when they become due or folks become eligible for that. Again, the middle column, pay as you go, assuming at this time, about 5.3 million in liability, no assets associated or put aside for that. Therefore, that net OPEB liability, which I touched on with regard to GASB 75 reporting, would be what is shown on the district's financial statements, versus, again, the annual benefit or pay-go that's being accrued each year, $304,000. Fast forward to 10 years, this district has set up a 115 trust funded over a 10-year period, you get the benefit of a lower or a higher discount rate because you are utilizing a 115 trust, meaning that the restrictions applied to a district's general fund does not apply to the 115 trust. You can take on a little bit more risk with regard to the investment portfolio, taking on equity holdings and try to earn a higher rate of return. That in turn lowers the district's liability, as well as the additional benefit of recognizing any assets put in to the trust. So in this case, now you have a lower accrued liability, that top line associated with that higher discount rate. You're able to recognize the assets, and now your net OPEB liability as a result has been lowered through the years, as well as the funded ratio. I like to look at anecdotally a school district that participated in this 115 trust for pre-funding OPEB, set up a trust back in 2006 in Northern California district, small district, but was proactive in trying to address their liabilities, put in monies to sort of grow their assets. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, they had these assets to rely on or use as sort of a rainy day fund, relieving sort of the stress on their general fund, able to pay out benefits from this trust rather than paying from their general fund. Subsequent to that financial crisis, they were able to build back up their assets and have really benefited with the setup of a 115 trust. So again, there are benefits, that recognizing assets for your financial statements, lowering your discount rate, letting your assets grow. Next slide, please. And so what are some misconceptions about OPEB pre-funding? So kind of touching on that earlier slide with the different approaches for paying out OPEB liabilities. The first one, can I lower my liability by putting money in the general fund? So unfortunately, districts that are simply paying out benefits or maybe earmarking are not able to recognize those assets. So again, in the previous slide, I noted that because it is in a 115 trust, you are able to recognize assets in that 115 trust versus earmarking or setting aside assets in a general fund. You do not have that benefit of recognizing those assets, and therefore it does not offset or lower your net OPEB liability. Second misconception about OPEB pre-funding, what if I set up the pre-funding trust? Am I obligated to make regular contributions? The short answer to that is no. Obviously, with the actuarial valuation, that is sort of a budgeting tool to try to address that liability, and you would ideally like to make contributions to build up those assets, to lower those liabilities. However, at the end of the day, the school district always has sort of the discretion and ability to determine how much to make contributions and sort of that frequency. So you are under no obligation to make regular contributions. Obviously, you would like to make contributions to address those liabilities and have those assets grow. But, as I mentioned in my example of that Northern California school districts, when times got tough, they were able to sort of draw down a little bit, stop making regular contributions. When times improved fiscally, they were then able to resume making those contributions. And another misconception, in setting up a pre-funding trust, will the money be stuck there even if you eliminate those OPEB benefits? At the end of the day, the OPEB benefits are a benefit for your employees, and you would like to protect those. If there are assets put into the OPEB trust or 115 trust, those would be used to pay out those liabilities. In the event that a district eliminates OPEB benefits, in the future, decides that it can no longer afford to pay out, once all obligations have been paid out, there's no more restrictions on those assets, and those any assets remaining would be returned to the district. So, next slide, please. And this maybe is a segue into the pension side. Chris touched on briefly the sort of the rising contribution rates associated with CalPERS and CalSTRS. Again, this is just a recap, something that everyone has been aware of in the past years, continually rising. The next slide, please, kind of illustrates specifically, the annual pension cost associated with the school district, how it can increase from year to year, and especially given the strain on the budgets and funding, this can greatly impact the school district's ability to manage these pension liabilities. So very similarly, if you could advance to the next slide, please, why do you want to pre-fund liabilities? A handful of reasons, as I touched on earlier with regard to the valuation, actuarial valuation, both applicable to both OPEB and pension, the ability to earn a higher rate of return than you would through your general fund. Because this is utilizing a 115 trust, you are able to utilize investment strategies that have mixes of equity and fixed income to try to earn a higher rate of return. As I noted with the valuation, those higher rate of returns can help lower your discount rate. Again, so you are trying to address these long-term costs, whether it is your OPEB, retiree health benefits, or your pension liabilities associated with those rising contribution costs. I highlighted with that school district that pre-fund their OPEB liabilities early in 2006 by starting early and setting up and growing these assets in a 115 trust. It essentially created a rainy day fund. So when economic times became difficult, they were able to tap into this 115 trust and pay out those specific liabilities rather than straining the general fund. I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, you're trying to protect these benefits that are associated or paid out or given to your employees, whether it's retiree health or their pension, by being in a better financial situation and addressing the unfunded liabilities. You're not only protecting those benefits that are due to your employees, to thank them for their hard work, but also addressing your district's own kind of financial health, and potentially can strengthen your credit rating as well. Next slide, please. Just real briefly, what strategies on the investment side are available to school districts utilizing a 115 trust? This can range from sort of your conservative to more aggressive with regard to how much fixed income you want to take on, as well as increasing the allocation for equities where you can sort of potentially earn a higher rate of return. So sort of from left to right, top to bottom, that kind of increases with regard to the investment risk, as well as the ability to earn a higher rate of return. So sort of based on your school district's financial position, investment horizon, risk tolerance, etc. Whichever 115 trust provider you are considering, they should have a menu of strategies available to your district to choose from to help sort of address the liabilities that you are looking to contain. Next slide gets into sort of the sample funding policies that school districts and other agencies utilizing a 115 trust have utilized. Again, this touches sort of on that flexibility and discretion available to school districts utilizing a 115 trust. Again, there are a lot of considerations with regard to your investment horizon. If you're looking at your retiree health liabilities, these may be a longer term cost that you're looking at 30 or 40 years. To shorter term with pension, maybe you're looking to utilize those funds in the next 5 to 10 years. So again, that is the beauty of utilizing a 115 trust, is that flexibility associated with, again, going back to that, there not being a requirement to fund contributions. It goes back to going back to the ability to fund at your discretion. Obviously you want to set aside assets to build those assets to address the liabilities, but you have that at the end of the day. And next slide, please. And the benefits of pre-funding. I kind of touched on this throughout my discussion, but at the end of the day, assets can be accessed at any time for OPEB or pension liabilities. So if you're utilizing one or the other or both buckets, you always have access to that at any time. Sometimes there's a negative connotation associated with this irrevocable trust. It just means that any assets put in have to be used for those specific liabilities. So you do have access at any time for those expenses. At the end of the day, this is addressing your liabilities by creating an asset. And again, I touched on that potential greater rate of return because you are taking on potentially equities that can earn a higher rate of return than you would be earning through your general fund. And again, I highlighted with that sample district that this could be a rainy day fund when times become tough. So again, just to wrap up in the 115 Trust, this is a very useful tool available to school districts and agencies for pre-funding liabilities. And maybe based on sort of the the constraints and challenging times of the budget as covered by Chris with the May revise, I can touch on real briefly the additional product that can be beneficial, which is an early retirement incentive. So if you could advance a couple of slides, please. Oftentimes districts are faced with cost cutting or cost saving. Unfortunately, that may bring into the discussion layoffs, which is something that districts never really want to do, but may have to consider. So with various challenges, an early retirement incentive may be a great alternative where districts can achieve both cost savings and prevent those layoffs and be achieve sort of a win-win scenario associated with that. Next slide, please. So what exactly is an early retirement incentive? Essentially this is a supplemental benefit paid to an employee on top of their underlying retirement system that they would receive either through STRS or PERS. By taking out or by that employee retiring, potentially the savings can be created by replacing that departing employee with a lower salaried employee. And by eliminating that higher salaried employee, this can reduce the number of positions needed to achieve savings. So, again, this is something that can be offered to a school district, looking at your demographics, group of employees deemed to be eligible based on a set of criteria where they may be eligible for early or retirement. Next slide, please. And what we've seen over the years is districts are offering an early retirement incentive for a host of different reasons. Maybe a number of reasons that are captured here, or maybe one specific reason. What we've seen over the years recently is just, especially with declining enrollments, this may be a need where you have a need to reduce the amount of staffing. As I mentioned before, hopefully with the incentive, this can achieve fiscal savings because of that lower replacement salary, or at the end of the day, mitigate potential future layoffs where you don't want to impact your employees. At the end of the day, you want to offer them this early retirement incentive, thank them for their many years of service, and at the same time create budget savings for the district. So again, if this is ever of a interest or need for your school district, PARS, we offer a complementary analysis where we can sort of look at your demographics, see where folks are, run that analysis, see what that potential impact would be, whether there'd be cost savings associated with the program or a cost, or whether there'd be savings or a cost, we would be transparent, and whether or not it makes sense to move forward with that. I think that concludes my portion, and I can pause for any questions or comments.
Yeah, if you have any questions for Ryan, please use the Q&A function. I see, Chris, you're handling some of the questions that are currently in there. So we have a few minutes if there are any questions that Ryan or Chris may be able to tackle. Chris has a hard stop at 11. He has to travel somewhere, so. See if they're coming in. Okay. Well, sorry, let me get organized here a little bit. All right, well, Thank you to those who submitted questions. If you still have any questions regarding discussed items in today's webinar, you may email them to csba@csba.org and our staff will assist. So if there's any questions that come up and you want us to get to them, please utilize csba@csba.org. Thank you to our panelists, Chris and Ryan, and thank you to our members for joining today's call. CSBA is dedicated to providing up-to-date resources to our school board members. To view our recent webinars, be sure to check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/CSBA video. If you're interested in attending future CSBA webinars, please go to our website at www.csba.org/webinars to register for upcoming webinars as well. Many thanks to our presenters, and with that, thank you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.